The winter air was sharp, carrying with it the silence of fields left barren after years of turmoil. England in the mid-12th century was not the land of orderly villages and secure markets it had once been under Norman rule. Instead, it bore the scars of a generation lost to civil strife, the period remembered as the Anarchy. Castles rose like thorns across the countryside, built hastily by barons eager to carve out their own domains. Justice was not a right, but a privilege purchased with loyalty or steel. Chroniclers wrote that Christ and his saints seemed to sleep, while ordinary people suffered under the weight of endless disputes. Into this broken landscape rode Henry Plantagenet, a young man of restless energy and iron will, determined to restore the kingdom his mother had claimed and his grandfather had once ruled with strength. The roots of the crisis stretched back to 1135, when King Henry III died without a surviving son. His daughter Matilda, known as the Empress, should have succeeded him, but her claim was contested by her cousin Stephen of Blois. Stephen seized the throne with speed, but his authority was fragile. England fell into nearly 20 years of war, raids, shifting loyalties, and wasted harvests. Villages burned, noble families schemed, and the crown itself seemed little more than a prize in a game of chance. For those who lived through it, lawlessness became normal life, a shadow that darkened every promise of order. By the early 1150s, exhaustion weighed on the realm, and eyes turned to the young heir of Matilda, Henry, who had inherited both her claim to England and his father's authority in Anjou. Henry had been shaped by struggle from the beginning. He crossed the Channel as a teenager to defend his inheritance, argued with seasoned lords, and displayed a mind that worked as fiercely as his sword. Those who met him remarked on his quick temper, but also his sharp intelligence. He was not content to play the role of a minor duke. His vision stretched beyond local feuds. He believed that kingship, if it was to endure, had to be something greater than personal favor or brute force. It had to be a structure of law and order strong enough to survive storms. When Stephen finally recognized him as heir through the Treaty of Wallingford in 1153, the path opened. A year later, Stephen was dead, and Henry sailed across the Channel to claim the throne of a weary kingdom. The coronation of Henry the Cepharians in 1154 was less a celebration than a solemn vow. The crown placed upon his head seemed heavier than gold, for it carried the weight of restoring a land fractured by decades of private war. His first acts were swift and decisive. He ordered the destruction of unauthorized castles, dismantling the strongholds that symbolized the arrogance of barons who had ruled like petty kings. He re-established royal justice by sending judges on circuits through the shires, ensuring that disputes were settled in the name of the crown rather than the whim of a local lord. He tightened control of revenues, coinage, and administration, signaling to all that the monarchy was no longer a fragile institution, but the cornerstone of the realm. In these measures, Henry did more than restore order. He built the framework of a system that would shape English governance for centuries to come. But the determination that allowed Henry to reassert royal power carried within it the seeds of conflict. The crown was not the only authority that claimed to stand above the barons. The church, wealthy and deeply woven into the life of the people, maintained its own courts, its own privileges, and a loyalty that reached beyond England to the papal throne in Rome. Where Henry saw a kingdom unified under royal justice, churchmen saw a sacred order that placed God's law above the will of kings. It was here, in the uneasy balance between secular and spiritual power, that the next great struggle of Henry's reign would emerge. The man who had rebuilt the monarchy would soon find himself tested not by rebellious lords, but by the conscience of his closest friend turned adversary. The dawn of the Plantagenet era was thus both a restoration and a warning. Out of the ashes of the anarchy, Henry II restored the dignity of kingship and the machinery of law. He gave the people reason to believe that justice could once again be trusted. Yet in fortifying the power of the crown, he set it on a collision course with Canterbury. The story of England's rebirth under Henry was not the end of conflict, but the beginning of a deeper and more dramatic clash, one that would echo through cathedrals and royal halls alike, and whose outcome would decide whether kings or priests held the final word over the souls and laws of the realm. In the heart of Europe, Far beyond the storm-beaten coasts of England, the city of Rome still cast a long shadow. The papacy, though often caught in its own struggles with emperors and factions, stood as the spiritual axis of Christendom. To kings and peasants alike, the Pope was more than a distant figure in white vestments. He was the voice of ultimate authority, the guardian of the keys to heaven. Monarchs might command armies and levy taxes, but their crowns rested uneasily if they drew the wrath of Rome. Excommunication was not merely a religious penalty, but a weapon that could unseat rulers and fracture realms. In this 12th century world, the Pope's word could pierce across mountains and seas, undermining the authority of any sovereign who dared to defy him. Within England itself, the Church was not a passive echo of Rome, but a vast power in its own right. It held nearly a quarter of all the land, richer and more secure than many noble houses. Monasteries rose like fortresses of faith, their cloisters filled with monks who copied manuscripts, tended fields, and prayed for the souls of kings. Cathedrals, still under construction in stone that seemed to scrape the heavens, dominated the towns around them. The site of Canterbury, Lincoln, or Winchester was not merely architectural wonder, but a declaration that spiritual authority had deep foundations in the very soil of England. The wealth of the Church brought not only comfort, but autonomy. Bishops were princes in all but name, commanding estates, collecting rents, and dispensing justice in their own courts. Parish priests, though humbler, stood at the center of village life, recording baptisms, marriages, and burials, the milestones that defined existence. Through its network of parishes, abbeys, and diocesan courts, the Church reached into every corner of the kingdom. It was a state within a state, loyal to Rome, yet deeply woven into English society. What made the Church especially formidable was not only its land or treasure, but its claim over conscience. The ecclesiastical courts judged not only matters of faith, but also disputes involving clergy, inheritance under church law, and even questions of morality. A priest accused of wrongdoing could often escape the harsh justice of the king's courts by pleading the privilege of benefit of clergy, placing himself under the jurisdiction of the church instead of the crown. This system, ancient and zealously defended, meant that thousands of men in holy orders, whether devout monks or barely literate clerks, were effectively shielded from royal justice. To Henry II, who envisioned a kingdom bound by uniform law, this was more than a nuisance. It was a fracture line in his vision of order. Yet to many ordinary people, the Church was not a rival to the king, but a sanctuary. In an age when kings might demand taxes and lords might levy troops, the parish church offered a different kind of power: the promise of salvation, the comfort of ritual, the ringing of bells on feast days. Pilgrims trudged long miles to visit holy shrines, carrying offerings of wax or coin. Markets often clustered near abbeys, where the sacred and the secular intertwined. The Church's authority, therefore, was not simply imposed from above, but embraced from below, rooted in the daily rhythms of devotion and hope. Still, the tension was unavoidable. The papacy insisted that only the Pope could appoint bishops or confirm their authority, while kings, relying on bishops as royal servants, demanded influence over such appointments. In England, this dispute had flared since the Norman conquest, simmering in the uneasy balance between archbishops and monarchs. By the time Henry II claimed his crown, the question was not whether conflict would return, but when. Thus, the stage was set. On one side stood a king determined to bind his realm under the supremacy of royal law, restoring the order lost during years of chaos. On the other side stood a church vast in wealth, unyielding in privilege, and bound to a higher allegiance in Rome. Between them stretched the fragile peace of a kingdom eager for stability, yet destined to become the theater of a deeper clash. And in this theater would soon emerge two figures, Henry and his chosen archbishop, whose bond of friendship would transform into one of the most dramatic confrontations of the Middle Ages. The storm that had battered England during the anarchy left behind not only broken walls and weary villages, but also a lesson that Henry II understood better than most. Divided power meant disorder. For a king who had watched his mother's claim nearly vanish in the chaos of baronial ambitions, there could be no tolerance for rivals to royal authority. His vision was clear and uncompromising: The crown must stand above every baron, every sheriff, and every court. If England was to prosper again, its people must look not to the whims of local lords or ancient privileges, but to the firm justice of the king himself. Yet standing against this determination was the other pillar of medieval life, the church. It was not simply an institution of prayer and ritual, but a network of immense wealth, independence, and allegiance that reached far beyond the English Channel. The clergy claimed rights that placed them beyond the reach of royal courts. Monks and priests answered not to Westminster, but to Rome, to the Pope, who carried himself as shepherd of all Christendom. In a land that Henry sought to weld into one body under the crown, the church remained an arm of another realm, loyal to a higher spiritual sovereignty. The conflict was not born of hatred, but of two visions of order that could not easily coexist. Henry sought to create a kingdom where law flowed downward from the throne, unbroken and uniform. The church sought to preserve a sphere of sacred authority immune to royal interference, where canon law reigned and appeals could travel across mountains to Rome itself. The crown demanded unity. The church defended immunity. Between these two positions lay the seeds of confrontation. From the castle towers, Henry looked out upon a kingdom he was determined to tame. He tore down the makeshift fortresses of rebellious nobles, asserting the supremacy of royal command. But just beyond those towers rose the spires of cathedrals, glowing with candlelight, where bishops and abbots presided with equal gravity. Their courts heard cases of inheritance, morality, and clerical discipline. Their influence penetrated into every parish. If Henry embodied the sword and seal of government, the church embodied the conscience of the nation. Together, they created a dual monarchy of sorts, each claiming to protect the people, each certain of its right to rule. Chroniclers of the age saw this tension not merely as politics, but as a drama ordained by heaven. The imagery practically wrote itself. Castles loom beneath gathering clouds, their battlements heavy with the weight of royal ambition. Across the valley, cloisters and abbey walls gleamed in pale light, symbols of eternal truth and divine order. England seemed to breathe between two great shadows, each stretching farther with every act of assertion. For the people, it was both a comfort and a source of unease. The crown promised justice and stability, while the church promised salvation and eternal security. How long could these promises coexist without collision? Henry knew the risk. He admired the discipline of the church, but he resented its refusal to yield to royal authority. He respected the Pope's spiritual role, yet he could not accept that foreign decrees might bind the King of England. Each royal reform brought him closer to that line where secular and spiritual power would collide. Each act of ecclesiastical defiance tested his patience. The land itself seemed to hold its breath as two giants circled, bound together, yet pulling apart. To look back on this moment is to see more than a quarrel between institutions. It was the prelude to one of the great struggles of the Middle Ages, the question of where ultimate authority resided. Could a king, crowned and anointed, command even the conscience of his people? Or did the church, guardian of souls and keeper of heaven's keys, hold the final word? These were not abstract debates, but living questions that would shape the destiny of England. And at the heart of that destiny stood Henry II and, soon, Thomas Becket. The drama of their confrontation was not yet upon the stage, but the scenery was ready. The lights dimmed, and the silence of expectation filled the hall. From the dark stones of royal fortresses to the golden altars of Canterbury, England bore witness to the rising tension. It is in these moments of gathering storm that history finds its most powerful voice. And it is here that the story of crown and church begins its fateful descent into conflict, a story that still resonates today. If you find yourself drawn into this unfolding drama, into the clash of ideals, loyalties, and power that defined an age, stay with the journey. Each chapter brings new revelations. Each turn of the tale unveils the choices that shaped not only kings and bishops, but the very fabric of English history. Let the narrative carry you, and if you wish to continue exploring the echoes of this world, remember to follow along so the story never leaves your side. Henry II carried within him a presence that no one in his age could easily ignore. He was not a king of distant ceremony, but of restless energy, a ruler who seemed never still, pacing corridors, riding across fields, forever thinking, forever planning. Chroniclers described him as sharp-eyed and sharp-tongued, quick to anger, but quicker still to act. He could charm with his wit one moment and terrify with his fury the next. What he lacked in polished majesty, he more than compensated for in relentless determination. This was not a monarch content to let tradition dictate his path. This was a man who believed he had been chosen to rebuild the very structure of kingship itself. At the heart of Henry's reign was a consuming ambition to bind the realm under one crown, one law, one enduring order. He had grown up amid the disorder of the anarchy, when barons turned their castles into personal kingdoms and justice fractured into countless local customs. That memory never left him. To Henry, the chaos of those years was not just a political disaster, but a wound on the very body of the realm. He was determined that such fragmentation would never return. His answer was a monarchy that reached into every corner of England, a system where the authority of the king's word would eclipse that of any noble lord or rival court. His reforms bore this vision at every turn. He revitalized the circuits of royal justice, sending his judges across the shires to hold the king's court in villages and towns. These itinerant justices carried with them not only parchment rolls, but the weight of the king's authority. They ensured that disputes over land, contracts, or inheritance could not be settled solely by the will of a baron, but had to answer to a higher law, the law of the crown. From these circuits would emerge the seeds of what later generations would call the common law, a system built not on arbitrary decrees, but on precedent and consistency. Henry's brilliance lay not only in his sense of order, but in his understanding of power. He knew that a crown resting on tradition alone could be toppled by noble resistance. He needed a foundation that was both practical and moral, one that convinced subjects that royal justice served their interests as much as his. By strengthening courts, by insisting on uniform measures of taxation, by bringing coinage and administration under tighter control, he made the crown more than a symbol. It became the central organ of a living state. But the same qualities that drove his reforms also made him a dangerous man to oppose. His temper was legendary. In council, he could rage against advisers who hesitated or contradicted him, his words cutting as sharply as any blade. He had little patience for delay, little tolerance for excuses. Yet beneath the volatility lay a consistency of purpose. Even his angriest outbursts were aimed at forcing forward the reforms he deemed essential. Those who served him learned quickly. Henry's storms passed, but his will endured. Cinematically, one might picture him striding through the halls of his palaces, maps spread before him, courtiers straining to keep pace as he dictated orders. His voice rose and fell with the rhythm of urgency. In another scene, he mounted on horseback, cloak snapping in the wind, riding from London to Winchester in a single day to oversee a judgment. He seemed less like a sovereign seated on a throne than like a force of nature sweeping across the realm, dragging the machinery of government with him. And yet, for all his vigor, Henry's greatest challenge was not in subduing barons or streamlining law. It was in convincing the kingdom that royal power could coexist with other sources of authority. For in his drive to centralize justice, he would inevitably collide with the church, which claimed its own courts and its own allegiance. Here, in the very qualities that made Henry a reformer, his intelligence, his impatience, his unyielding ambition, lay the seeds of conflict with those who believed that spiritual authority must stand above the king. Thus, the portrait of Henry II in the early years of his reign is that of a monarch reforming with one hand and provoking with the other. He was brilliant and decisive, ambitious beyond measure, convinced that he alone could heal the wounds of the past. His reforms stitched together the torn fabric of England, but the threads he pulled tightened around other powers unwilling to be bound. The stage was set for confrontation, and Henry's fiery spirit would ensure that when it came, it would not be easily resolved. Thomas Becket's story began far from the glitter of courts and palaces. He was born in London around the year 1120, the son of a modest Norman merchant who had settled in the bustling city. His family lived not in splendor, but in the practical comfort of a household where trade was the lifeblood and social advancement seemed a distant dream. The young Thomas grew up amid the noise of markets and the river traffic of the Thames, where goods from across Europe arrived daily. He was neither heir to vast estates nor groomed from birth for power, but what he possessed was a sharp mind, a strong memory, and a restless drive to rise beyond the circumstances of his birth. As a boy, he was sent to school in London and later to Paris, where he absorbed the rhythms of Latin grammar, canon law, and the habits of clerical discipline. Education offered him what birth had not, a path upward through the ranks of church and state. Those who encountered him as a young man often remarked on his courtesy and quick wit, his ability to move with equal ease among scholars, merchants, and nobles. He lacked wealth, but not ambition. In an age when talent could sometimes eclipse lineage, Thomas Becket embodied the possibility of unexpected ascent. His first steps into prominence came through the service of Theobald, the Archbishop of Canterbury. Under Theobald's patronage, Thomas traveled on diplomatic missions to Rome, learning firsthand the complexities of papal politics. He gained a reputation for skill in negotiation and loyalty in service. More importantly, he learned how power was managed not only through swords and castles, but through words, persuasion, and networks of obligation. This apprenticeship in the corridors of church power prepared him for the more formidable task that soon awaited him. When Henry II took the throne in 1154, he needed not only soldiers and sheriffs, but also minds capable of carrying out his reforms. He found one in Thomas Becket. In 1155, Henry appointed him Lord Chancellor, the king's chief administrative officer. For a man of Becket's background, it was a staggering rise. From the son of a merchant to the keeper of royal seals and the manager of the crown's business, Becket had leapt into the very heart of government. As chancellor, Becket proved himself indispensable. He oversaw royal revenues, managed the estates of the crown, and represented the king in legal disputes. He organized levies for the king's campaigns and ensured that justice was dispensed according to Henry's will. He also shared in the life of the court with a brilliance that surprised many. Becket dressed with elegance, entertained lavishly, and carried himself with the assurance of a man born to nobility, though all knew he was not. His household rivaled that of great earls, and his charisma won him allies as well as rivals. Yet behind the display was a mind perfectly attuned to Henry's ambitions. The two men became inseparable. Henry, intense and impatient, found in Becket a companion who could match his energy and translate his vision into reality. They hunted together, dined together, and spoke with the easy candor of equals, though in status they were anything but. Henry valued Becket not only as a servant, but as a friend. Few others could challenge the king's temper without provoking wrath. Becket often did, and Henry seemed to relish it. Chroniclers described scenes of the two laughing, debating, even quarreling, only to emerge with their bond stronger than before. For Becket, the partnership was both opportunity and test. He enjoyed the confidence of the king, but also bore the weight of executing policies that reshaped the realm. He became the visible face of royal authority, carrying decrees into every corner of the kingdom. His loyalty to Henry was unmistakable. He was, in many ways, the living extension of the king's will. To the barons and bishops who watched them, Henry and Becket appeared as a pair, crown and chancellor, monarch and minister, united in purpose. And yet, beneath the brilliance of their friendship lay unspoken tensions. Becket, though indulgent in his role as chancellor, never entirely abandoned the identity of a churchman. He had been nurtured by clerical mentors, educated in canon law, and tied by instinct to the rhythms of ecclesiastical life. Henry, ambitious to bind all authority under his crown, saw in Becket a tool to secure the church as well as the state. But what Henry saw as utility, Becket saw as calling. The seeds of future conflict were quietly germinating, even in the days when their laughter filled the halls of Westminster. Cinematically, the image of Becket in these years might be painted as a man straddling two worlds. By day, he strode through the royal chancery, his robes sweeping across marble floors, parchment in hand, the seal of the king pressed at his side. By night, he dined with nobles, his words sharp, his charm irresistible, his table glowing with the trappings of power. Yet somewhere behind the confident smile and polished demeanor was the boy from London, shaped by both humility and hunger, caught, between loyalty to his king and the deeper loyalties of his soul. Thus, Thomas Becket entered history not merely as a servant of the crown, but as a figure whose rise embodied the shifting tides of the 12th century. His ascent from modest birth to the highest office beneath the throne was a triumph of intellect, charisma, and opportunity. But the very qualities that drew Henry to him would one day turn the two friends into adversaries, and their story into one of the most unforgettable dramas of the Middle Ages. The bond between Henry II and Thomas Becket soon grew into one of the most remarkable friendships of their age. What began as a working relationship between king and chancellor deepened into a companionship that seemed, to observers, almost unbreakable. In Henry's restless world of politics, where loyalty was often conditional and alliances fleeting, Becket stood apart. He was not merely an official who carried out the king's commands. He was the confidant who laughed with him, argued with him, and shared his daily life with an intimacy rare for a monarch. The two men hunted side by side through the forests of England, their horses pounding across the earth, hounds racing ahead as the king and his chancellor urged each other on. The chase was more than a pastime. It was a ritual of trust. Henry, impulsive and often consumed by the burdens of kingship, seemed to find release in Becket's company. Together they would race, jest, and trade sharp words, and at the end of the day, the king often looked more like a companion than a sovereign. Their nights were no less vivid. Banquets at court became stages where Becket's wit and charm matched the king's own vigor. The chancellor's table sparkled with silverware and laughter, where nobles marveled at the closeness between the son of a London merchant and the ruler of vast dominions stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees. To many it seemed extraordinary, even unsettling, that Becket should be allowed such influence. Yet Henry trusted him, not only with state matters but with the small confidences of daily life. He was, as contemporaries described, the king's other self. Becket's role in the court was not limited to companionship. He became the visible executor of Henry's policies, ensuring that royal authority was felt in every corner of the realm. If Henry demanded levies for war in Normandy, it was Becket who organized the logistics, summoned men, and saw the king's coffers filled. If disputes arose among nobles, it was often Becket who carried the royal judgment. His hands were everywhere, and his loyalty appeared absolute. In council chambers, when others hesitated before the king's temper, Becket spoke plainly, confident that his friendship with Henry gave him the freedom no one else enjoyed. Cinematically, one might imagine the two riding across the open meadows of England, their horses side by side beneath the golden light of afternoon. The king, cloaked in his authority yet laughing freely, turned to his chancellor, who answered with equal ease. It was an image of comradeship, of two men bound by energy and vision striding together toward the horizon. To those who saw them, the partnership seemed unshakable, a harmony of crown and servant rare in any age. Yet within that golden light lay the long shadow of what was to come. For Henry, Becket was the perfect companion, intelligent enough to grasp his ambitions, bold enough to carry them out, and entertaining enough to ease the burdens of rule. For Becket, Henry was both patron and friend, the figure who had lifted him from service into the highest ranks of power. Each needed the other, and for a time, each seemed to complete the other, yet the very intensity of their bond concealed the fragility beneath. Henry saw in Becket a tool to secure his vision of monarchy. Becket, though loyal, carried within him a conscience tied to the church that had shaped his youth. The court marveled at their closeness. Some envied it. Others whispered that no king should lean so heavily on one man. But Henry ignored the murmurs. He delighted in Becket's company, often more than in the company of queens or barons. Together, they embodied a partnership that seemed to fuse intellect, loyalty, and power into a single force. In the chronicles of the time, their friendship appeared almost legendary, a tale of mutual trust rare in the shifting sands of medieval politics. And yet, like the image of two riders bathed in sunlight, it was a beauty destined to fade. History reminds us that bonds forged in trust can, under the weight of duty and conflicting visions, unravel into enmity. For now, however, Henry and Becket rode together, their laughter carried on the wind, their partnership casting a glow across the kingdom. The seeds of tragedy had been sown, though neither man yet understood that their closeness so admired and envied, would become the very source of the storm that would one day consume them both. The year 1162 opened with an opportunity that Henry II believed would secure his vision of a kingdom united beneath royal justice. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Theobald, had died, leaving vacant the highest ecclesiastical seat in England. Whoever occupied that chair would not only oversee the clergy, but also serve as the symbolic bridge between England and Rome. To Henry, the position was not merely religious, it was political, the linchpin of control over a church that too often resisted his reforms. The king required someone loyal, someone practical, someone who would place the interests of the crown above those of the papal curia. His choice was obvious: his trusted friend and chancellor, Thomas Becket. To Henry, the logic was flawless. Becket had been his companion in every enterprise, his partner in hunting, laughter, and reform. As chancellor, Becket had managed the machinery of state with efficiency and brilliance. Surely, if he were elevated to the archbishopric, he would remain what he had always been, Henry's right hand, only now cloaked in the vestments of the church. With Becket presiding over Canterbury, the king would finally break the last barrier to his authority. The clergy would bow to the same will that guided the barons, and the realm would stand united. Henry pressed the appointment forward with determination. Some bishops hesitated, doubting Becket's suitability. They knew him as a courtier, a man of banquets and finery, not a figure of spiritual austerity. But the king's will prevailed, and by the spring of 1162, Thomas Becket was elected Archbishop of Canterbury. Henry celebrated the move as a triumph of strategy. He believed he had outmaneuvered the church itself. But the transformation that followed confounded his expectations. From the moment Becket accepted the pallium, his life altered in ways that startled friend and foe alike. Gone was the lavish courtier, whose tables overflowed with silver and whose household rivaled noble estates. In his place emerged a man who embraced the rigors of devotion with startling severity. Becket adopted a life of austerity, dressing in simple robes, eating plain food, and spending long hours in prayer. The gaiety of the chancellor gave way to the gravity of the archbishop. It was as though the office had awakened a deeper allegiance dormant within him, calling him not to serve the crown, but to guard the church with uncompromising zeal. Contemporaries recorded their astonishment. Bishops who had doubted his seriousness now marveled at his discipline. Monks spoke of his humility, his devotion to ritual, his insistence that the clergy uphold the strictest standards of behavior. For Becket himself, the change was not a performance, but a revelation. Having accepted the role, he felt bound to protect the rights and independence of the church as fiercely as he had once protected the authority of the crown. Where Henry had expected an ally, he found instead a guardian who refused to yield. This transformation quickly bore political consequence. Henry sought to curb the privileges of the clergy, especially the right of clerics accused of crimes to be tried only in ecclesiastical courts. The king, ever the reformer, saw such exemptions as intolerable gaps in the reach of royal law. To him, justice could not be divided. All subjects, whether nobleman, merchant, or priest, must answer to the same authority. He assumed Becket would understand, would help him rationalize and enforce this principle. Instead, Becket stood in open opposition. The archbishop argued that the clergy were bound by higher laws, answerable to Rome and to God above any earthly sovereign. To strip them of their immunities was, in his view, to violate the sacred order of Christendom. He would not compromise, even for the king who had been his dearest companion. The debate between them began in council chambers, where Henry urged, cajoled, even pleaded, only to be met with Becket's calm refusal. What had once been laughter and trust turned now to tension and silence. Henry could scarcely believe the reversal. To him, Becket's resistance was not principle, but betrayal. How could the man he had raised from modest birth, the friend he had trusted beyond all others, now defy him? The king's temper, already infamous, grew darker with every clash. He raged before his court, declaring that Becket had turned against him, that the archbishop now served not crown or country, but a foreign master in Rome. What had been the strength of their friendship now deepened the sting of division. Cinematically, one might picture the moment of Becket's consecration. In the dim light of Canterbury Cathedral, candles flickered against stone walls as chants filled the air. The newly anointed archbishop knelt in solemn prayer, his face lit by the glow of devotion. In the shadows, Henry's gaze lingered, his expression clouded with the realization that the man before him was no longer his chancellor, no longer his ally, but a figure claimed by another authority. The image was haunting. The bond of friendship sanctified, yet severed in the same instant, a candle's light casting the outline of betrayal across the king's brow. From this moment forward, their paths diverged. Becket embraced his role as shepherd of the church, refusing to yield its independence. He disciplined clergy, asserted ecclesiastical privilege, and reminded all who listened that the church stood above earthly command. Henry, meanwhile, pressed harder for reforms, determined to bend every institution beneath the crown. Each advance by one was a provocation to the other. Their private friendship, once unshakable, was now caught in the gears of history, grinding toward inevitable conflict. The court trembled at the change. Nobles who had once envied Becket's closeness to the king now watched with wary eyes, uncertain whether to align with the monarch's wrath or the archbishop's sanctity. Bishops found themselves divided, some favoring compromise, others inspired by Becket's defiance. The people, hearing rumors of quarrels between crown and church, wondered which authority would prevail over their lives and souls. Henry's fury grew not only from Becket's resistance, but from the intimacy of their shared past. Every refusal reminded him of hunts once shared, of banquets once enjoyed, of laughter that now seemed mocking echoes. To lose a minister was one thing, to lose a friend to opposition was another. His rage was the rage of a wounded companion as much as a frustrated sovereign, and Becket, for his part, felt the weight of the transformation with equal heaviness. He knew the cost of his stance, knew it meant estrangement from the man who had lifted him so high. Yet he could not turn aside. To betray the church was, to his conscience, to betray the calling that defined him. His heart might have mourned the friendship, but his will was anchored in faith. Thus, in the early 1160s, England stood at a crossroads. The crown demanded supremacy, the church claimed immunity, and between them, two men, once united in laughter and loyalty, now faced one another across an ever-widening gulf. The sunlit image of king and chancellor riding side by side had given way to the shadowed vision of king and archbishop locked in opposition. The stage was set for the drama that would soon convulse the realm, the struggle between Henry II and Thomas Becket, between crown and church, between friendship and principle. The consequences of this transformation could already be felt in the uneasy silence of council chambers, in the whispers of courtiers, and in the anxious prayers of monks who sensed that history itself was shifting. England, so recently stitched together by Henry's reforms, was now threatened by a rift at the very heart of power. What had begun as strategy had become tragedy, and in the dim glow of cathedral candles, the future loomed with the certainty of storm. The tension that had simmered between Henry II and Thomas Becket now hardened into open confrontation. By 1164, the king resolved to make his authority explicit, to codify in writing the supremacy of royal law over the privileges of the church. The result was a document known as the Constitutions of Clarendon, a set of 16 articles designed to restrain ecclesiastical independence and bind clerical justice to the crown. To Henry, the matter seemed a necessary reform. He was weary of priests accused of crimes escaping the severity of secular courts by claiming the benefit of clergy. He was frustrated that appeals could leap across the channel to Rome, undermining judgments issued in his own realm. He wished to ensure that bishops, like barons, remained accountable to the crown. The constitutions demanded, among other things, that no cleric could leave the kingdom without royal consent, that no appeals could bypass the king's court, and that disputes involving clergy first be tried before secular judges. In Henry's mind, these measures were not innovations but restorations, a return to the customs of his grandfather, Henry I, when royal and ecclesiastical law coexisted under the primacy of the crown. The assembly at Clarendon was meant to be a show of unity. Bishops, barons, and royal officials gathered in the great hall, its timbered roof echoing with the murmur of expectation. Henry, towering in presence and temper, stood before them and demanded assent. The barons agreed swiftly, eager to strengthen royal authority and weary of clerical immunity. Many bishops hesitated, torn between loyalty to their king and obedience to Rome. All eyes, however, turned toward one man, the Archbishop of Canterbury. Becket, who had once been the king's closest ally, now stood as his greatest obstacle. His transformation from chancellor to archbishop had already shocked the court, but his stance at Clarendon sealed the division. When Henry urged him to sign, Becket resisted. He argued that the church was not the crown's servant, but God's, that its liberties were ancient and inviolable, protected by canon law and papal authority. To place ecclesiastical courts under secular oversight was, in his view, to subvert divine order. The pressure was immense. Henry thundered that he sought only to uphold the customs of his ancestors. Barons muttered that the kingdom would never know peace if priests stood above the law. Bishops pleaded with Becket to yield, fearing the king's wrath and the collapse of unity. For a brief moment, under duress, Becket appeared to waver. He even gave a guarded promise to observe the customs, hoping perhaps to avert immediate crisis. Yet when the written text was laid before him, his conscience rebelled. He refused to affix his seal. The refusal struck like a hammer. In the king's eyes, it was defiance, a betrayal not only of his reforms, but of their long friendship. In Becket's eyes, it was fidelity to the church, to Rome, to the higher law of God. What had once been a private quarrel between friends now became a constitutional crisis, one that reached to the very roots of authority in the realm. Cinematically, one might imagine the scene within the wooden hall at Clarendon. Torches hissed against the damp air, shadows swayed across stone floors, and the gathered lords leaned forward in tense silence. Henry's face was flushed with anger, his voice filling the chamber, demanding submission. Becket, robed in ecclesiastical black, stood motionless, his hand hovering above the parchment, but never descending. The stillness was thunderous, a single refusal set against the weight of the crown. When the council broke, nothing was resolved. The barons had pledged their loyalty to the king, but the archbishop had drawn a line that could not easily be erased. Henry left Clarendon seething, his reforms challenged at their core. Becket departed carrying not triumph, but foreboding, knowing that his defiance had set him on a path from which there would be no retreat. The clash of legal principles had become a clash of wills, and in that clash both men sensed history itself was being rewritten. The confrontation at Clarendon had left scars too deep to heal. Henry the Sanguine, who had expected submission, now faced an archbishop unwilling to bend. The king's anger hardened into action. In 1164, he summoned Thomas Becket before the royal court, demanding that the archbishop answer not only for his defiance, but for alleged abuses during his years as chancellor. The charges were many, ranging from mismanagement of royal revenues to failure in fulfilling obligations owed to the crown. To Henry, the trial was a means of crushing resistance under the weight of law. To Becket, it was a weapon aimed not at his record, but at his independence. The assembly was held at Northampton, a gathering that carried the air of judgment rather than reconciliation. Nobles, bishops, and officials crowded into the hall, the tension thick with expectation. Henry's supporters pressed forward the accusations, reciting them one by one, each intended to humiliate and corner the archbishop. Yet Becket stood resolute. He listened in silence, then spoke with measured dignity, declaring that no secular court had the right to try the head of the English church. His words were not loud, but they cut through the murmurs of the assembly. By refusing to acknowledge the authority of the king's tribunal, he placed himself squarely under the protection of Rome. The scene grew restless. Some bishops loyal to the crown urged him to submit, warning that defiance would bring ruin. Others looked away, unwilling to meet his gaze. Becket himself seemed to recognize the isolation pressing in around him, but he did not waver. At last, with calm determination, he announced that he appealed directly to the Pope. Then, before Henry's judges could pronounce a sentence, he turned and walked out of the hall. The crowd parted as he passed, murmuring in disbelief. For the first time in memory, a subject had defied the king so openly in his own court. Henry's fury was boundless. He declared Becket guilty and stripped him of estates and possessions. Yet punishment within England was no longer enough. The archbishop had invoked the authority of Rome, and that appeal placed the matter beyond immediate resolution. Becket, sensing the danger that now surrounded him, knew he could not remain in the kingdom. To stay would be to invite imprisonment, or worse. Thus, in the closing months of 1164, he made the decision to cross the Channel. Becket's departure was neither triumphant nor secretive, but marked by gravity. Leaving England meant leaving behind not only his post, but also the land of his birth, the cathedral he cherished, and the friendship that had once defined his life. He slipped away, under cover of night, a solitary figure moving toward exile. The shores of England receded behind him, and the uncertain horizon of France stretched ahead. In France, he would find both refuge and challenge. King Louis VII, eager to check the growing power of Henry II, offered him protection. The papacy, itself embroiled in conflicts with the Holy Roman Emperor, welcomed Becket as a symbol of resistance to secular encroachment. Yet exile was no comfort. Becket lived modestly in monasteries, removed from the wealth and authority that had once defined his days. His letters, dispatched across Europe, carried appeals for justice, pleas for intervention, and steadfast declarations that the liberties of the Church could not be surrendered. The trial and exile marked a turning point in the struggle. The conflict was no longer private, no longer confined to the personal bond between king and archbishop. It had become an international matter, drawing in France, Rome, and the currents of European politics. For Henry, it was a humiliation. The man he had raised to greatness now stood beyond his reach, casting his defiance from foreign soil. For Becket, it was both burden and opportunity. He had lost his homeland, but gained a platform from which to confront the crown with the authority of the wider church. England, meanwhile, waited uneasily. The king remained powerful, but the absence of Becket was a wound in the body of the realm. The people whispered of their archbishop's courage, some praising him as a defender of God's law, others muttering that his pride had endangered the kingdom. Whatever the judgment, the exile of Thomas Becket was a moment no one could ignore. The bond of friendship had shattered completely, and in its place stood a conflict that would shake thrones and altars alike. Exile did not silence Thomas Becket, it amplified him. From his refuge in France, his quarrel with Henry II soon grew into a matter no longer confined to the English crown and church. The fate of one archbishop became entangled with the wider politics of Europe, drawing in kings, popes, and the shifting alliances of a continent already strained by rivalries. At the center of this larger stage stood Pope Alexander III. Recently elected, Alexander faced his own struggle for legitimacy. A rival pope set up by the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa had plunged Christendom into schism. To maintain his authority, Alexander needed to assert papal supremacy wherever it was challenged. Becket's defiance against Henry offered precisely that chance. By championing the exiled archbishop, Alexander could remind all Europe that no king, however powerful, could disregard the rights of the church. Letters flowed from Rome affirming Becket's status, promising support, and warning Henry that continued aggression risked placing him outside the bounds of Christian obedience. Across the Channel, King Louis VII of France also seized upon Becket's plight. Long overshadowed by the vigor and resources of Henry II's Angevin Empire, Louis had often searched for ways to weaken his rival. The quarrel between king and archbishop offered him an opening. By sheltering Becket, he presented himself as defender of the church, winning favor with Rome while at the same time pricking the pride of his Angevin neighbor. The court of Paris became a stage for diplomacy, with envoys from England, Rome, and Normandy converging to negotiate, protest, or conspire. For Henry, the international turn of events was a bitter humiliation. What he had intended as a domestic reform now drew the eyes of Europe. Becket, once his servant, now spoke as a symbol of resistance, his voice echoing from monasteries and papal courts. The king dispatched his own envoys to Rome, pressing Alexander to curb Becket's obstinacy, arguing that the archbishop's defiance threatened not only royal authority, but also political stability. Yet Alexander, cautious and shrewd, refused to abandon his champion. To do so would have been to concede victory to secular power at a moment when the Morii papacy itself needed to project strength. Negotiations stretched on, often tense, often fruitless. At times, compromises were drafted, proposals that Becket might return to England with certain guarantees, or that Henry might withdraw the most offensive of his demands. Yet each time, mistrust poisoned the process. Henry demanded submission. Becket insisted on principle. Neither would bend. Each letter sent across Europe, each audience at the papal court, deepened the sense that this was no longer a quarrel of two men, but a question of the very balance between throne and altar. Meanwhile, Becket's presence in France drew sympathy from monasteries and scholars alike. Chroniclers recorded his humility in exile, noting his prayers, his fasting, his unyielding dedication to the cause he had embraced. To many, he became a living witness that spiritual authority could stand against royal will. To others, he seemed reckless, willing to plunge kingdoms into turmoil rather than concede. But in either case, his name was spoken across Christendom, his story debated in cloisters and courts far from England's shores. Henry, restless and unrelenting, attempted to strike back by tightening his grip at home. He sought to ensure that the English clergy remained loyal to him, threatening confiscation of lands and revenues for those who corresponded too warmly with their exiled archbishop. Yet repression only deepened the sense that the king was at war with the very fabric of the church. The spectacle of Becket in exile, upheld by Rome and France, contrasted sharply with Henry's fury, casting the king not as a reformer, but as a persecutor in the eyes of many abroad. By the late 1160s, the conflict had become inseparable from the broader currents of European politics. The papacy, anxious to assert its primacy, held firm behind Becket. The French crown, eager to weaken its Angevin rival, gave him shelter. Even the emperor and his supporters watched closely, calculating how the quarrel might tilt the balance of power. The struggle that had begun in the council halls of Clarendon now reverberated across a continent, its outcome uncertain, its stakes immense. Thus, the exile of Thomas Becket did not diminish the drama, it magnified it. A quarrel born of friendship turned sour had become a contest of kingdoms and faiths, binding together the destinies of men who never shared the same hall. The voice of an archbishop in France now carried into every chamber of Europe, and the question that haunted all was clear. Could a king bend the church to his will, or would the church bend kings to its own? The answer would shape not only the fate of Henry and Becket, but the very pattern of power in medieval Christendom. Thomas Becket's exile in France stretched into years, and with each passing season, his resolve grew sharper. When he had first crossed the Channel in late 1164, it was with the weight of defeat heavy upon him. He had left behind his cathedral, his clerics, and the land of his birth. Yet what seemed at first like abandonment soon became transformation. Stripped of wealth, deprived of the trappings of office, he began to fashion himself into a figure of singular purpose. His first task was survival. The king had confiscated his estates and cut off his revenues. Becket found himself dependent on the charity of others. For a man who had once presided over banquets as chancellor, the change was stark. He lived in monasteries and abbeys scattered across France. His lodgings austere, his meals plain. Monks recalled that he shared in their rhythm of prayer and fasting, walking in the cloisters not as a grand archbishop in exile, but as one of their own. Poverty became his daily companion, but it also gave his defiance a moral edge. Where Henry radiated the power of a monarch, Becket radiated the simplicity of one who had chosen conscience over comfort. Support soon came from quarters Henry could not silence. Pope Alexander III, himself embattled against the Holy Roman Emperor and his anti-pope, saw in Becket a champion of the wider struggle between church and crown. Letters from Rome encouraged him, affirming his authority as archbishop, warning English bishops not to abandon him, and placing Henry on notice that papal censure was never far away. These letters carried across Europe, copied and read aloud, spreading Becket's name beyond the confines of France and England. Equally important was the favor of King Louis XVII of France. Though often overshadowed by his Angevin rival, Louis recognized the value of hosting Henry's exiled adversary. By offering Becket protection, he not only gained leverage over Henry, but also burnished his image as a defender of the church. Audiences at the French court became stages where Becket pleaded his case, drawing sympathy from nobles, clergy, and even foreign envoys. To Henry, this was salt in an open wound. The friend who had once dined at his side now spoke words of defiance beneath the roof of a rival king. The years of exile hardened Becket's character. The man who had once thrived in the luxuries of office was replaced by one who embraced austerity. His letters to Rome and to allies in England were filled with appeals for justice, but they also revealed a newfound severity. He insisted on the independence of the church with unyielding clarity, condemning the idea that any king could dictate the liberties of clergy or the obedience owed to Rome. He spoke now not as a courtier with divided loyalties, but as a shepherd convinced of his sacred duty. His allies, both clerical and lay, were struck by this transformation. Some remembered the glittering chancellor who had outshone nobles at feasts. Now they encountered an archbishop who wore coarse garments and ate with the humility of a monk. They may have wondered if such change could endure, but Becket's resolve silenced doubt. His hardship became his testimony. Every deprivation underscored the righteousness of his stand. Meanwhile, Henry's fury only deepened. The king's envoys pursued Becket across France, attempting to pressure monasteries into withdrawing their hospitality, demanding that Louis VII curb his support. Yet Henry's efforts often backfired, for every attempt to isolate Becket only highlighted the archbishop's resilience. The sight of him persisting in poverty, upheld by Rome and sheltered by France, made the contrast between crown and church sharper than ever. By the close of the decade, Becket's exile had become more than a period of waiting. It was a crucible. Within the cloisters of France, he refined his role, not as Henry's lost companion, but as the embodiment of resistance to royal encroachment. His life had narrowed in material terms, yet his influence had widened across Christendom. England remained beyond his reach, but his absence from Canterbury had turned him into a symbol larger than the city itself. The man who once managed the king's finances now walked barefoot in abbey halls, his worldly riches gone, but his spirit fortified. He had exchanged power for principle, and in doing so, had placed himself at the heart of a contest that all of Europe watched with growing intensity. The friendship that had bound him to Henry was now a memory, but the cause that divided them had become a banner, and Becket carried it with the determination of one who believed eternity, not kingship, was the true measure of victory. By the late 1160s, Henry II found himself caught in a web of pressures that demanded resolution. His Angevin empire stretched from the windswept coasts of Ireland to the mountains of Aquitaine, but its vastness was also its vulnerability. Discontent stirred among barons who bristled at his centralizing authority. In Normandy, whispers of rebellion circulated, and in Aquitaine, local lords resisted the iron grip of royal officials. To maintain stability across so many lands, Henry needed peace with the church. The quarrel with Becket, once a domestic affair, now threatened to weaken his position at the very moment he could least afford division. Envoys became the lifeblood of this uneasy stalemate. Messengers rode tirelessly between Henry's court and the papal curia, between the king's castles and Becket's monasteries in France. They carried proposals, counter-proposals, promises, and threats. Henry insisted that Becket recognize the constitutions of Clarendon and acknowledge royal authority over ecclesiastical matters. Becket, unwavering, demanded full restoration of church liberties and the annulment of the disputed articles. Neither side yielded. Each letter sent carried the tension of two men whose wills were too strong to bend. Papal diplomacy, already stretched by the broader conflicts of Christendom, attempted to mediate. Pope Alexander III sought compromise, anxious not to alienate either the English crown or his steadfast archbishop. Cardinals pressed Becket to consider moderation. Papal legates urged Henry to show restraint, but the gulf between principle and power proved too wide. Henry wanted practical submission, something he could display to his barons as proof of victory. Becket wanted moral vindication, a confirmation that the church stood beyond the reach of secular command. Their positions, though often wrapped in polite negotiation, were immovable. Henry's frustration deepened with each passing month. He needed the loyalty of his bishops to sustain order, yet many wavered, uncertain whether to side with their king or their archbishop. His barons watched keenly, measuring whether the king could subdue even the head of the church. Any sign of weakness risked emboldening rivals. Thus, every embassy to Becket carried not only the weight of diplomacy, but the survival of Henry's broader authority. Becket, for his part, endured the constant pressure with a stubborn serenity. He knew the hardships of exile, yet he would not barter away principle for comfort or return. His letters, dispatched to England and Rome alike, reaffirmed his stance. He spoke of the liberties of the Church, not as privileges granted by kings, but as eternal rights guarded by God. To concede would be to betray both his office and his conscience. Those who urged compromise found him firm, and those who threatened him found him unafraid. In council chambers, the negotiations became rituals of frustration. Henry's envoys offered terms, Becket refused, and the cycle repeated. Each failed mission left the king more exasperated, while Becket grew ever more convinced that endurance itself was his weapon. The archbishop's poverty, his isolation, his refusal to bow, these became symbols not of weakness, but of incorruptible faith. Meanwhile, the realm lived in suspense. Bishops feared to act too openly for either side, lest they draw punishment from king or pope. Barons muttered that the quarrel distracted the crown from more urgent matters. Ordinary people, hearing fragments of the story, wondered why their king and their archbishop could not find peace. Yet in the silence of stalemate, a truth emerged. This was no longer about legal formulas or disputed customs. It was a test of endurance, of whether royal power could break the conscience of one man, or whether that conscience could stand firm against the might of a king. As the years of negotiation dragged on, Henry's need for resolution grew sharper, but Becket's resolve grew harder. Two wills once bound together in friendship, now strained against each other like iron against stone. The outcome remained uncertain, but the path toward reconciliation seemed ever more narrow. Europe watched, Rome mediated, France protected, and England waited. The contest endured, unresolved, suspended in a tense balance that only time or tragedy could break. By the late 1160s, Henry II found himself caught in a web of pressures that demanded resolution. His Angevin empire stretched from the wind-swept coasts of Ireland to the mountains of Aquitaine, but its vastness was also its vulnerability. Discontent stirred among barons who bristled at his centralizing authority. In Normandy, whispers of rebellion circulated, and in Aquitaine, local lords resisted the iron grip of royal officials. To maintain stability across so many lands, Henry needed peace with the Church. The quarrel with Becket, once a domestic affair, now threatened to weaken his position at the very moment he could least afford division. Envoys became the lifeblood of this uneasy stalemate. Messengers rode tirelessly between Henry's court and the papal curia, between the king's castles and Becket's monasteries in France. They carried proposals, counter-proposals, promises, and threats. Henry insisted that Becket recognize the constitutions of Clarendon and acknowledge royal authority over ecclesiastical matters. Becket, unwavering, demanded full restoration of church liberties and the annulment of the disputed articles. Neither side yielded. Each letter sent carried the tension of two men whose wills were too strong to bend. Papal diplomacy, already stretched by the broader conflicts of Christendom, attempted to mediate. Pope Alexander III sought compromise, anxious not to alienate either the English crown or his steadfast archbishop. Cardinals pressed Becket to consider moderation. Papal legates urged Henry to show restraint. But the gulf between principle and power proved too wide. Henry wanted practical submission, something he could display to his barons as proof of victory. Becket wanted moral vindication, a confirmation that the Church stood beyond the reach of secular command. Their positions, though often wrapped in polite negotiation, were immovable. Henry's frustration deepened with each passing month. He needed the loyalty of his bishops to sustain order, yet many wavered, uncertain whether to side with their king or their archbishop. His barons watched keenly, measuring whether the king could subdue even the head of the Church. Any sign of weakness risked emboldening rivals. Thus, every embassy to Becket carried not only the weight of diplomacy, but the survival of Henry's broader authority. Becket, for his part, endured the constant pressure with a stubborn serenity. He knew the hardships of exile, yet he would not barter away principle for comfort or return. His letters, dispatched to England and Rome alike, reaffirmed his stance. He spoke of the liberties of the Church not as privileges granted by kings, but as eternal rights guarded by God. To concede would be to betray both his office and his conscience. Those who urged compromise found him firm, and those who threatened him found him unafraid. In council chambers, the negotiations became rituals of frustration. Henry's envoys offered terms, Becket refused, and the cycle repeated. Each failed mission left the king more exasperated, while Becket grew ever more convinced that endurance itself was his weapon. The Archbishop's poverty, his isolation, his refusal to bow, these became symbols not of weakness, but of incorruptible faith. Meanwhile, the realm lived in suspense. Bishops feared to act too openly for either side, lest they draw punishment from king or pope. Barons muttered that the quarrel distracted the crown from more urgent matters. Ordinary people, hearing fragments of the story, wondered why their king and their archbishop could not find peace. Yet in the silence of stalemate, a truth emerged. This was no longer about legal formulas or disputed customs. It was a test of endurance, of whether royal power could break the conscience of one man, or whether that conscience could stand firm against the might of a king. As the years of negotiation dragged on, Henry's need for resolution grew sharper, but Becket's resolve grew harder. Two wills, once bound together in friendship, now strained against each other like iron against stone. The outcome remained uncertain, but the path toward reconciliation seemed ever more narrow. Europe watched, Rome mediated, France protected, and England waited. The contest endured, unresolved, suspended in a tense balance that only time or tragedy could break. By the year 1170, the quarrel that had raged for nearly 6 years seemed to exhaust even the combatants themselves. Henry II, burdened by the weight of ruling an empire that stretched across England, Normandy, and into the south of France, could not afford a perpetual standoff with his archbishop. Rebellion simmered among his barons, and his continental rivals watched eagerly for any sign of weakness. Pope Alexander III, equally weary of the impasse, urged reconciliation. Against this backdrop, the outlines of a fragile settlement began to take shape. The negotiations were cautious, marked by hesitation on both sides. Henry desired resolution not from reconciliation of principle, but from necessity. He needed Becket back under the crown's eye, where his influence could be contained and his defiance more easily managed. Becket, for his part, longed to return to his cathedral, to his clergy, and to the people of England who had whispered his name as both martyr-in-waiting and defender of the faith. Yet he refused to compromise on the liberties of the Church. Each meeting between envoys carried the weight of years of bitterness, but eventually a formula was found. Henry would allow Becket to return, and Becket would offer words of loyalty without conceding the core of ecclesiastical independence. It was no triumph, but it was enough. In the summer of 1170, Becket was permitted to cross the Channel. The news spread quickly across England, carried by rumor and proclamation, stirring anticipation in villages and cities alike. When he set foot once more on English soil, he was no longer simply the Archbishop of Canterbury. To many, he had become something greater, a living symbol of resistance, a man who had endured exile and poverty for the sake of the Church. Crowds gathered along the roads to cheer his procession. Men and women knelt as he passed, touching his garments, calling him blessed. In their eyes, his return was a kind of miracle, a vindication that the Church could not be crushed by royal power. For Henry, the moment was far more complex. He had agreed to Becket's return, but he did not welcome the triumphal reception. He needed calm, not spectacle, unity, not adulation of a rival authority. Watching from afar, he sensed how quickly the people's loyalty could turn from crown to crozier. The very settlement that he had hoped would pacify the kingdom instead breathed new life into Becket's cause. Becket himself was acutely aware of the fragile balance. His letters during these months reveal both joy and caution. He spoke of the grace of God in restoring him to his flock, yet he also noted the dangers ahead. He knew Henry's temper had not softened, nor his ambition diminished. The reconciliation had been born of convenience, not of true harmony. Still, Becket embraced his return as a mission renewed. His sermons in Canterbury rang with fervor, calling upon the clergy to remain steadfast and the laity to hold firm to the faith. The cathedral resounded with chants of welcome, as though a shepherd had returned to guard his sheep. The fragile peace was visible everywhere, in the careful smiles exchanged by bishops who dared not reveal their true loyalties, in the guarded language of charters that avoided explicit mention of Clarendon, in the uneasy silence between king and archbishop. Both men knew the settlement could not last. It was a pause, not a conclusion, a lull before the next storm. Yet for the people who thronged to Canterbury, none of that mattered. To them, Thomas Becket was no longer merely a churchman. He was the embodiment of courage, a figure who seemed to walk with the light of sanctity even before his death. Thus, the summer of 1170 brought England a reconciliation, but one written in sand rather than stone. Becket's return ignited hope. Henry's consent masked simmering resentment, and Europe looked on, sensing that this was only an interlude. The king and the archbishop had clasped hands once more, but the grip was tense, and beneath it lay the fault lines of a conflict that had never truly ended. The truce that had brought Thomas Becket back to England in 1170 proved fragile from the very beginning. For a few short months it seemed as though peace might hold. The king went about the business of governance. The archbishop resumed his duties at Canterbury, and the people rejoiced in what felt like reconciliation. Yet beneath the surface, suspicion lingered. Henry had not abandoned his conviction that royal authority must be absolute, and Becket had not forgotten his vow to defend the liberties of the church. The settlement, born of expediency, carried within it the seeds of collapse. The spark came when Henry arranged the coronation of his son, the young. Henry, at Westminster. Traditionally, such a right belonged solely to the Archbishop of Canterbury, yet Henry entrusted the ceremony to the Archbishop of York and several bishops loyal to the crown. To Becket, this was no mere slight. It was an assault on the prerogatives of his office and a direct challenge to the authority of Canterbury itself. Even more, it symbolized the king's determination to bend the ancient customs of the church to his will. Becket's response was decisive. Summoning his authority as primate of England, he issued sentences of excommunication against the bishops who had participated. Their names were read aloud with solemn finality, cutting them off from the sacraments and branding them as violators of sacred law. The act was both spiritual and political. By wielding the weapon of excommunication, Becket declared to all that no alliance with the crown could place a bishop above the discipline of the church. News of these actions traveled swiftly. In monasteries and villages alike, people whispered that the archbishop had once again defied the king. Some hailed his courage, seeing in his boldness the living proof that spiritual authority could not be silenced. Others feared the consequences, knowing Henry's temper and the dangers of provoking him in such a public manner. For the bishops under sentence, it was humiliation. For Henry, it was provocation of the highest order. When word reached the king, his anger was immediate and unrestrained. To him, Becket's move was nothing less than betrayal, an open attempt to undermine his rule before his own subjects and the wider world. The coronation of his son had been meant as a demonstration of dynastic strength. Becket had turned it into a point of contention, stripping it of triumph and filling it with controversy. Henry's frustration, long simmering, now boiled over. This, he felt, was the final challenge, the last insult he could bear, from the man who had once been his closest companion. The court echoed with Henry's wrath. Courtiers whispered anxiously, sensing that the king's patience had run its course. His allies urged him to act, to rid himself of an archbishop who had defied him at every turn. The excommunication of bishops was not merely a spiritual censure, it was a political act that threatened the unity of the realm. For Henry, the message was intolerable. If even his bishops could be cast out at Becket's word, then royal authority itself stood diminished. Becket, meanwhile, did not shrink from the storm he had unleashed. At Canterbury, he carried on his duties with a mixture of serenity and resolve. He knew the risks of his actions, but to him, the cause was worth the danger. He had returned from exile not to compromise, but to fulfill his charge as guardian of the church. If excommunication was the price of defending its liberties, then he would wield it without hesitation. Thus, in the closing months of 1170, the uneasy peace shattered. The king and the archbishop, once bound by friendship, now stood locked in irreconcilable opposition. One claimed the supremacy of the crown, the other invoked the sanctity of the church. Every gesture, every word carried the weight of finality. Those who watched from the sidelines sensed that the struggle had reached its climax. The question was no longer whether reconciliation was possible, but when and how the conflict would erupt into its ultimate conclusion. The breach between king and archbishop had reached its breaking point. By the winter of 1170, Henry II was encircled by frustration. His attempts at compromise had dissolved, his hopes of silencing Becket through diplomacy had failed, and now, in the wake of excommunications, he saw his realm threatened not by foreign enemies, but by a man he had once called friend. Becket's defiance cast a shadow across the very image of royal authority. Every act of resistance reminded the barons that even the king's command could be challenged. Every sentence of excommunication whispered that the church stood above the crown. Henry's court became the crucible of his rage. Gathered in Normandy, his household knights and courtiers heard him brood over Becket's provocations. The archbishop's return, far from restoring peace, had turned into a constant humiliation. Reports arrived daily, Becket's sermons drawing crowds in Canterbury, his censures against bishops spreading fear through the clergy, his defiance echoing beyond the Channel. The king, restless and weary, paced the halls of his palace, his temper unraveling with each new reminder of defiance. It was in such a moment, late in the year, that Henry's fury found its infamous expression. Surrounded by loyal men who had served him in war and council, he let slip the words that history would never forget. "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" The phrase was not issued as a command in the strict sense, but as the anguished cry of a king whose patience had shattered. To Henry, it was an outburst of exasperation, the release of anger pent up over years of betrayal. To those who heard it, it carried the weight of royal will, a dangerous mixture of frustration and implied sanction. The knights who stood nearby, men of ambition, loyalty, and fierce devotion to their sovereign, did not take the king's words lightly. For them, the king's frustration was more than private lament. It was a call to act, an opportunity to prove their service by silencing the source of the crown's humiliation. The silence that followed Henry's outburst was charged, as though the air itself carried the force of his anger into their hearts. Henry himself may not have intended what would come. Chroniclers later debated whether the king truly sought Becket's death or merely his removal from public life. Yet in that moment, his words unleashed consequences beyond recall. The fatal mixture of wounded pride, royal wrath, and knightly zeal had been set in motion. In the days that followed, the knights who had heard the king's cry began to whisper among themselves. To them, Becket had become not only a rebellious archbishop, but a threat to the king's authority, a living rebuke that tarnished the crown. If their sovereign despaired of this man, then perhaps it fell to them to act where diplomacy had failed. Thus the stage was set for the most tragic moment of their long struggle. What had begun as friendship, deepened into partnership, and collapsed into enmity was now racing toward its fateful climax. The king's anguished words had lit a fuse, and in the charged silence of his court, the outcome was already beginning to take shape. The question no longer lingered in the air. It had been spoken aloud, and those who heard it believed they had been summoned to answer. In the waning days of December 1170, the king's fateful words began to take on a life of their own. 4 knights of Henry's household, Reginald Fitzurse, Hugh de Morville, William de Tracy, and Richard le Breton, absorbed the meaning more literally than perhaps their sovereign intended. They had heard the cry of a monarch humiliated, a ruler whose patience with Thomas Becket had finally broken. To them the message was unmistakable. If the king's tongue had not issued an order, his heart surely demanded one. These men were not strangers to Henry's service. Each had fought in his campaigns, stood by him in councils, and enjoyed the rewards of royal favor. Ambitious and zealous, they carried within them both loyalty to the crown and the desire to prove themselves indispensable. Becket, in their eyes, was more than a defiant archbishop. He was a threat to the unity of the realm, an obstacle to the king's authority, and a figure whose removal would restore their sovereign's honor. The words spoken in anger now resounded as a summons. Quietly, without fanfare, the 4 began to move. They gathered provisions and armed themselves, their preparations cloaked beneath the ordinary routines of a noble household. Soon after, they slipped away, traveling across the Channel toward England. The winter seas were rough, but their purpose lent them resolve. Each mile carried them closer to Canterbury, to the man whose defiance had provoked the king's anguished cry. Their journey was not only physical but symbolic. They carried with them the weight of Henry's wrath and the urgency of restoring his authority. Though no parchment bore the royal seal, though no official warrant named Becket an enemy, the knights convinced themselves that their mission was sanctioned by the spirit of the king's words. To hesitate would be to fail in loyalty. To act would be to embody the very will of their sovereign. In England, word of their approach spread slowly. Travelers along the roads whispered of armed men riding with grim purpose, of knights bound for Canterbury not in peace, but with intent. Yet few could imagine the gravity of what was to come. Becket himself, still at his cathedral, continued his duties with calm resolution. He had faced exile, threats, and humiliation. Now he faced the unknown. His letters and sermons spoke of faith and duty, even as the clouds of danger gathered. The knights, hardened by service and emboldened by the king's fury, pressed on toward their destination. Behind them lay the echo of Henry's outburst. Before them loomed the stones of Canterbury Cathedral. Their names, Fitzurse, de Morville, de Tracy, Le Breton, would soon be etched into history, bound forever to the act they believed would restore their king's peace. Yet as they rode, the air itself seemed heavy, as if the world paused in anticipation of the reckoning that awaited. Thus began the final approach. 4 men carrying the weight of loyalty twisted into violence advanced toward the most sacred seat in England. The path they chose would change not only their own lives, but the course of a kingdom. For within the walls of Canterbury, archbishop and knights would soon converge, and the long conflict between crown and church would reach its fatal crescendo. On the cold afternoon of December 29th, 1170, the long conflict between king and archbishop reached its terrible climax. The 4 knights, hardened by resolve and driven by what they believed to be their sovereign's unspoken will, rode into Canterbury. Their presence sent murmurs through the city. Some townsfolk scattered in fear, while others followed at a distance, uncertain but compelled by the gravity of the moment. The knights made their way to the archbishop's palace, demanding an audience with Thomas Becket. Inside, Becket's clerics urged him to seek safety. They reminded him of the threats, begged him to hide behind the fortified walls, even to flee from Canterbury altogether. But Becket stood firm. He had endured exile, returned in triumph, and now carried himself with the serenity of a man who knew that the struggle had reached its end. To run, he declared, would be to abandon his duty. His place was with his church, and if that meant standing face to face with his enemies, so be it. When the knights stormed into his chamber, their voices rang with accusation. They demanded that Becket submit, lift the excommunications, and reconcile himself to the king's authority. He refused. His answers were calm but unyielding. The liberties of the church, he said, were not his to give away. They were the inheritance of Christendom itself. His words struck the air with finality, leaving no space for compromise. The knights departed, but their silence as they withdrew carried a chilling weight. Everyone present sensed they would return. As twilight approached, the bells of Canterbury Cathedral began to toll for evening service. Becket rose from his seat and began walking toward the church. Clerics surrounded him, pleading that he remain inside. "Father, do not go," they cried. "They will kill you." But Becket only shook his head. His voice was steady, resolute. "This is God's house," he answered, "and here his servant must remain. I will not turn it into a fortress. I will not flee." He crossed the courtyard, his robes catching the winter air, and stepped through the great doors of the cathedral. The flicker of candles lit the vast stone interior, casting long shadows along the columns. Monks at prayer turned in astonishment as their archbishop entered, his face calm, his stride deliberate. Behind him, the sound of armored footsteps grew louder. The knights had returned. They rushed into the sacred space, their armor clattering against the stones. The monks screamed for Becket to retreat deeper into the church, but he stood before the altar, tall and composed. His hands were not raised in defense, but open, as if embracing his fate. He looked upon the men who had once served the same king he had loved and defied, and he spoke his final words with clarity. "For the name of Christ and the defense of his church, I am ready." In that instant, the meaning of his long struggle crystallized. He was no longer the chancellor of Henry's court, nor the exiled archbishop pleading for papal support. He was a shepherd who had chosen to lay down his life for his flock. He had endured banishment, stood against the power of a king, and now, in the echoing stillness of the cathedral, he accepted the price of loyalty to conscience. Outside, the December sky darkened into night. Inside, the confrontation reached its irrevocable conclusion. The cathedral, which had for centuries been a place of worship and peace, had become the stage for one of the most fateful moments in England's history. The clash between crown and church, between king and archbishop, had found its ending not in compromise, but in sacrifice. And in that sacrifice, Thomas Becket passed into legend, his final stand echoing through the ages as the moment when principle stood firm, even at the edge of death. The air inside Canterbury Cathedral grew tense as the four knights closed in on Thomas Becket. The sacred silence of the great church clashed with the sound of their armor striking against the stone floor. Monks and clerics cried out, some rushing forward to shield their archbishop, others frozen in fear. Becket himself remained unmoved. His stance was steady, his gaze unwavering, as if he had already resigned himself to the destiny that awaited. The knights confronted him before the altar, their voices thundered with demands. He must revoke the excommunications, submit to the king, and abandon his defiance. Becket answered with words that cut deeper than steel. He would never betray the liberty of the church, never bend his conscience to the will of any earthly crown. His refusal hung in the vaulted air, echoing like a verdict. Then came the moment that history would never forget. The knights, driven by the weight of Henry's fury and their own unyielding zeal, raised their blades. The clash of steel against stone reverberated through the cathedral. Monks shrieked, some fleeing, others weeping at the altar rail. Becket stood firm, offering no resistance, his final words a prayer for the church he had sworn to protect. The scene that followed seared itself into memory. In the dim light of candles, the archbishop fell upon the hard marble floor. The sacred space, once filled with chants of worship, was now shaken by the cries of despair. To those present, it felt as though the very walls of Canterbury trembled at the violation committed within its heart. The cathedral had become not only a house of prayer, but the stage of a martyrdom. When the knights withdrew, the silence they left behind was heavy and unbearable. The clerics gathered around their fallen shepherd, their grief mingling with awe. For in that terrible moment, Thomas Becket had been transformed. No longer simply the archbishop, no longer merely the king's defiant subject, he had become a witness, one whose blood sealed the testimony of conscience against the might of kings. Outside, the December night pressed in upon the city. Word spread quickly, first in hushed voices, then in cries that rang through the streets. The Archbishop of Canterbury was dead, struck down within his own cathedral. Shock rippled outward across England and soon across Europe. To many, it was more than a crime. It was a sacrilege, a wound inflicted not only upon a man, but upon the church itself. Thus, in the shadows of Canterbury, a single act of violence reverberated far beyond the stone walls where it had occurred. The martyrdom of Thomas Becket would ignite a storm that no king could contain, and the memory of that night would burn in the conscience of Christendom for centuries to come. The news of Thomas Becket's death spread with astonishing speed, carried by messengers, pilgrims, and merchants, until it seemed that all Christendom spoke of Canterbury. What had happened within the cathedral was not perceived as the silencing of a troublesome subject, but as the desecration of a sacred servant of God. The shock rippled outward from England's shores, crossing the Channel, and soon it was the talk of courts, monasteries, and marketplaces across Europe. At Rome, Pope Alexander III responded with fury and grief. For years he had defended Becket as a champion of ecclesiastical liberty, and now the archbishop's blood had sealed that testimony. From the papal curia came letters of condemnation, declaring that the crime was not merely against a man but against the whole church. The murder of a consecrated archbishop within his own cathedral was an affront to the sanctity of Christian order. Alexander pronounced censures against the knights who carried out the deed, and all eyes turned to Henry II. Whether he had spoken in anger or in command mattered little. To the world, he bore the stain of responsibility. In Paris, Louis VII of France wasted no opportunity to cast blame on his rival. He styled himself as the defender of the martyred archbishop, welcoming Becket's exiled clerks and ensuring that every court in Europe knew where guilt lay. For Louis, the tragedy was a chance to weaken the mighty Angevin king, but his words also reflected the genuine horror that Becket's death inspired. The idea that a sovereign could so pressure his knights that they would strike down the head of the English church shook the very foundations of trust between throne and altar. Meanwhile, the common people of England and beyond began to speak of Becket not as a defeated rebel, but as a saint. Almost immediately, stories emerged of miracles at his tomb. Pilgrims came from nearby villages to pray where he had fallen, bringing candles and whispered petitions. Some claimed healing, others spoke of visions, and soon his name was invoked in chapels far from Canterbury. The man who had once walked in exile, clad in humility, was now remembered as a shepherd who had laid down his life for his flock. Henry II, across the Channel in Normandy, found himself besieged not by armies, but by reputation. He had sought to control the church. Instead, he was branded as the king who had slain its champion. Envoys from every corner of Christendom arrived demanding explanation, and his enemies seized upon the moment to tarnish his name. Even his own allies urged him toward penance, warning that without reconciliation, his soul and his crown were at risk. Chroniclers of the age recorded the tremors with a sense of awe. They wrote that the murder of Thomas Becket had altered the balance of Christendom. No longer was he a political figure alone. He had become a symbol. His death was interpreted as witness to eternal truth, a declaration that the church stood beyond the reach of earthly power. Monks compared him to the martyrs of the early faith, men and women who had faced emperors and chosen principle over survival. In every corner of Europe, the memory of Canterbury reverberated. Becket's name became a rallying cry, his story a warning to rulers who might imagine themselves supreme over sacred law. What had been meant to silence him had only amplified his voice. His final stand, taken in the echoing halls of his cathedral, had become the spark for a devotion that crossed borders, languages, and centuries. And while Henry struggled to contain the storm, the tide of reverence for Becket swelled, until it seemed that all of Christendom bent its gaze toward Canterbury, where a martyr's tomb was already becoming a shrine. By the summer of 1174, the weight of Becket's martyrdom had become unbearable for Henry II. The king, who had once towered over his realm with unshakable authority, now found himself hemmed in by suspicion, penance, and the judgment of Christendom. His enemies abroad denounced him, his barons at home murmured discontent, and the Pope himself pressed for acts of atonement. The name of Thomas Becket, invoked daily in churches and whispered among pilgrims, had grown so powerful that even a king could not ignore it. The moment of reckoning arrived when Henry returned to England to quell unrest and restore his image. He chose Canterbury, the very city where his archbishop had fallen, as the stage for his public submission. It was a decision both political and spiritual. By humbling himself at the shrine of the man whose death had been laid at his door, Henry hoped to silence critics, win back the loyalty of the church, and restore the sanctity of his kingship. The scene that unfolded was unlike any in English history. Clad not in the finery of state, but in the simple garb of penitence, the most powerful monarch in Europe approached the great cathedral. Crowds lined the streets, straining to see the king who had once ruled with iron resolve, now walking barefoot over the stones of Canterbury. His face, usually fierce and commanding, was solemn. For the first time in years, Henry came not as ruler, but as penitent. Inside, before the shrine of Thomas Becket, the air was heavy with expectation. Monks and clerics gathered, their chants echoing through the vaulted arches. Henry knelt, his head bowed low, and spoke aloud his confession. He acknowledged the burden of guilt that clung to his name, whether by intent or neglect, for the death of his archbishop. His words carried through the nave, witnessed by those who had once trembled at his authority and now beheld his contrition. What followed etched itself into memory. At Henry's own request, the monks of Canterbury came forward, each carrying a rod. One by one, they struck the king across his back in ritual penance. The blows were not meant to wound, but to symbolize the submission of crown to altar, the acknowledgement that no man, not even a monarch, stood above the judgment of God. Henry bore the penance in silence, his body still, his lips moving in prayer. When the ceremony ended, the king rose slowly, his face pale but resolute. The crowds that had once murmured of his guilt now gasped at the sight of a king humbled in the dust. News of the penance traveled swiftly, and with it came a shift in perception. Henry had not erased the stain of Becket's death, but he had met it with humility. In the eyes of many, this act of contrition transformed him from persecutor to penitent, restoring a measure of legitimacy to his reign. For the church, the message was unmistakable. The blood of a martyr had brought a king to his knees. For Henry, the penance was both humiliation and necessity, a reminder that even rulers must bend before the altar. And for Christendom, the image of the most powerful monarch of the age, kneeling barefoot in Canterbury, became a lasting symbol of the fragile balance between crown and church, a moment when power itself was compelled to bow before conscience. In the years immediately following his death, Thomas Becket's name grew beyond the bounds of England, transcending politics and transforming into a symbol of faith that echoed throughout Christendom. Stories of miracles at his tomb spread rapidly. Pilgrims claimed to be healed of infirmities. Sailors invoked his protection against storms, and the poor whispered prayers in his name, believing their voices carried more swiftly to heaven when tied to his memory. Within only 3 years of his death, the momentum was undeniable. In 1173, Pope Alexander III, recognizing both the groundswell of devotion and the political weight of Becket's sacrifice, canonized him as Saint Thomas of Canterbury. The declaration carried immense significance. Rarely had the Church elevated a figure to sainthood so swiftly, and never one whose conflict with a reigning monarch remained so fresh. The act was not only an affirmation of Becket's sanctity, but also a rebuke to the notion that earthly crowns could override the liberties of the Church. With a single pronouncement, Rome had transformed the martyred archbishop into one of the most revered saints of the medieval world. From that moment, Canterbury was forever changed. What had once been the seat of the English Church became a beacon for pilgrims from every corner of Europe. Roads leading to the city grew crowded with travelers, nobles seeking absolution, peasants in search of healing, merchants hoping for blessings upon their trade. The shrine of St. Thomas, adorned with offerings of gold, silver, and candles, became a place where the spiritual and the temporal converged. Kings knelt beside beggars, bishops prayed beside common folk, all united in reverence before the tomb of the man who had given his life for conscience. The economic and cultural impact was immense. Canterbury blossomed into a thriving center of pilgrimage, second only to Rome and Santiago de Compostela. Inns multiplied, markets expanded, and chroniclers recorded the steady flow of visitors who carried Becket's story back to their homelands. The cult of St. Thomas reached even the most distant shores. In Scandinavia, chapels were dedicated to him. In Italy, mosaics depicted his final stand. In France and the Low Countries, his image adorned reliquaries. Wherever his story traveled, it reinforced the lesson that faith could humble power, and that principle could endure beyond the grave. For Henry II, the canonization was both a humiliation and a strange reprieve. Though it enshrined forever the man who had defied him, it also allowed Henry to reconcile his legacy with the Church. By submitting to penance and embracing Becket's cult, the king could show himself not as the slayer of a bishop, but as the repentant monarch who acknowledged a saint. For the English people, however, the meaning was deeper. In Becket, they found not only a martyr, but a protector, a heavenly advocate who understood suffering and had faced down the greatest throne in Europe. Thus, within a few short years, the quarrel that had begun as a dispute over laws and liberties became a cornerstone of medieval devotion. Thomas Becket, once Henry's brilliant chancellor and later his implacable adversary, was now celebrated as one of the most powerful saints of the Middle Ages. His shrine at Canterbury drew kings, queens, popes, and pilgrims in endless procession, ensuring that his memory would endure not merely as a figure of history, but as a presence alive in the faith of millions. In this transformation, the arc of the story reached its conclusion. A friendship that had collapsed into enmity, a conflict that had shaken kingdoms, had now given birth to a symbol that outlasted both men. Becket's voice, silenced in life, spoke louder in sainthood. And Canterbury, once the scene of tragedy, became the heart of a devotion that bound together crown and church, ruler and subject, in the shadow of a man whose final stand became eternal. The death and canonization of Thomas Becket left a mark on Europe that outlasted the lives of kings, the turn of dynasties, and the passing of centuries. His story became more than a tale of personal conflict between a monarch and an archbishop. It crystallized one of the great themes of the medieval age, the boundary between crown and church. Until Becket's stand, the lines had been blurred, with kings often claiming rights over bishops and ecclesiastical courts, while popes sought to pull the secular world into their orbit. After Canterbury, the question could no longer be ignored. His martyrdom forced both rulers and clerics to confront the limits of their power. For Henry II, the struggle revealed both the reach and the limits of royal authority. He remained a powerful king, but never again could he move against the liberties of the church without invoking Becket's shadow. In the minds of his contemporaries, the archbishop's death had turned into a kind of living rebuke. Whenever the crown pressed too heavily upon spiritual freedoms, Becket's memory rose as a warning. For the papacy, his example was invaluable. Rome could point to Canterbury as proof that the church stood above the sword, that even the mightiest ruler could be humbled when conscience and sanctity were placed in opposition to temporal ambition. In England, Becket's figure grew into more than that of a saintly protector. He became a symbol woven into the fabric of national identity. Pilgrims who traveled to Canterbury did so not only for healing or absolution, but also to affirm the enduring truth that faith could resist tyranny. Writers, poets, and chroniclers cast him as the archetype of sacrifice for belief, a man who chose loyalty to God above loyalty to king. His shrine became a school of memory, where generation after generation learned that conscience could demand a higher price than comfort, and that fidelity to principle could shape history itself. Over time, the story of Thomas Becket resonated far beyond medieval England. In continental Europe, his cult served as inspiration for movements that challenged secular overreach, and in later centuries, reformers, thinkers, and rulers alike invoked his name, sometimes as a warning, sometimes as an example. The tension he embodied remained a central drama of Western civilization, the question of where spiritual allegiance ends and political obedience begins. The enduring power of Becket's story lies in its dual nature. To the faithful, he was a saint, a man who gave his life for the church and was rewarded with eternal glory. To the historian, he was a pivot point in the evolution of governance, an event that redefined the balance of sacred and secular. To the poet, he was a tragic hero, caught between friendship and faith, loyalty and conscience. And to rulers across the centuries, he was a reminder that no throne, however mighty, is immune from the judgment of principle. Thus, the legacy of Thomas Becket endures not as a relic of medieval conflict, but as a lasting parable of power, conscience, and sacrifice. His stand at Canterbury drew a line in the sand between temporal and spiritual authority, a line that kings and popes alike would test and contest for generations to come. And in the hushed reverence of pilgrims at his shrine, in the echo of his story across Europe, his image remained, a man whose final act was to give all for belief, and whose memory became a beacon of faith's resilience against the shifting tides of earthly power. In the end, the story of Thomas Becket is not only the chronicle of a quarrel between a king and an archbishop, but the enduring drama of principle against power. His fall within the stones of Canterbury turned conflict into legend, and legend into faith. For centuries, pilgrims traced the path to his shrine, rulers remembered his defiance, and the church drew strength from his witness. Becket's legacy reminds us that history is shaped as much by conscience as by conquest, and that the voice of one man standing firm against the might of a crown can echo across the ages.